Hey friends, knowing how to manage your cloud spending is a critical skill to have. Fortunately, Azure provides tools, reports, guidance, and more to help you control costs. One of my favorite guests, Barry, is back to show me how easy it can be to manage my cloud spending today on Azure Friday. Hey friends, I'm Scott Hanselman and it's Azure Friday. I'm here with Barry. Azure Barry, how are you, sir?
I'm very good. Thank you. How are you?
I am very well, and I'm excited to see one of your epic slide decks because you put together the most clear information about Azure that I've ever seen, and that's why we have you back. And today we're going to talk about managing, reporting, and reducing costs in Azure. You know, I love to pinch pennies in the cloud because Hanselman International is just me and 10 websites. So anything I can do to work with my Azure cost management is going to be a great thing for me to learn today.
Hey, I do the same. So, there's no shame in that. And everybody really should because, money is valuable. And
Absolutely.
so I always like to think about what are the things then that cost money. So let's take a look at the first slide here where we discuss the first things that cost money in the cloud. So there are several things and maybe some things that you didn't think about. So an obvious thing that costs money in the cloud is obviously the services that you use. So these are things like databases, Azure App Service, or your VM, for instance. And these services can have different tiers. So you can, for instance, run a small VM with 1 gigabyte of RAM and maybe 2 cores of CPU. That might not be as expensive as, let's say, a bigger VM that has 32 gigabytes of RAM, 16 cores, and maybe a GPU even. And that goes for all of these services. So this is an obvious one, right? Services that you use in Azure, those cost money, of course. Now, what is something else that costs money in Azure? That is storage. Also, uh, not a very much a surprise, but it is something that costs money. So the things that you store in, for instance, Azure Storage, but also in your databases, cost money. And then what costs money? Well, the amount of data that you store there. So a gigabyte costs less than a petabyte, let's say. But also the way you store it and the service tier of the storage services that you use. For instance, in Azure Storage, Azure Blob Storage, for instance, you could use a premium storage tier, which has several premium features as well. It has more redundancy, more availability, for instance. It can be faster as well, and therefore is more expensive than a lower tier. And also, you can segment your data, let's say again in Azure Storage, into different tiers of readiness, let's say. So, for instance, data that you store in an archive tier, which you might not use every day or every minute, but you might want to use every week or so, or maybe want to pull up after a year. That's less expensive than something in a hot tier that you use constantly with your active application, let's say. So things that you store in the cloud also cost money, and that depends on how much data that you store and what type of data that you store. Now, another one that might not be as obvious is network traffic. So, data that goes in and out of the cloud. So, Azure has these massive data centers, right? You might have seen one, and that's where these services run. So, your app service and your VM. Let's say you have a website in your app service, and you go there from a web browser, from your phone or from your computer. Then you download data from the Azure data center onto your client, so onto your browser. Now, this data you can segment into ingress and egress. And ingress is data that goes into the Azure data center, and that is usually free. There's a couple of caveats there, but let's say that's free. And egress, that is data that comes out of the Azure data center, like I just described. So, for instance, you're downloading images, video files from a website that you're running in Azure. That costs money. And this is something that you really need to pay attention to. So, a small story here. I had a client once that had a virtual machine running on premises on a server under somebody's desk, and that was running some BI, so service that made reports. And every hour or so, it would pull a complete copy of a very huge database of like 10 gigabytes that was running in Azure onto itself and then create that report. So every hour, 10 gigabytes came out of the Azure data center, and that added up to a huge Azure bill. And at first, we didn't know what that was about because we weren't running anything special there. But that turned out to be the egress, so the data that came out of Azure. So something to pay attention to.
So you're
And then
allowed to move data within the Azure data center. Like if you're in West US or West Europe,
yes,
you can run it around inside the box, the Azure box. But as soon as it
yes.
leaves the box and jumps to another data center, then that's egress, right?
Yes, that's a very good point that you make there. So let's say you have West Europe, which is an Azure region, which has multiple data centers within it. So within the data center, yes, there is multiple VMs that you might own. Maybe they send over data to each other, or for instance, your app service that gets data from a SQL database. That's all free, that internal communication. However, when you start to move data between Azure regions, for instance, from EU West to, let's say, East US, so over the pond even, that might cost money. Not in all cases, but it might cost money as well. So it depends indeed, but in general, when you move data locally within your Azure box, that's also for free. Yeah. So another thing that costs money in the cloud is, you might not think about this, is software licenses. These are things that you, for instance, use in your Azure virtual machine. So when you create an Azure virtual machine that runs, let's say, a Windows Server Data Center Edition, that has a license for that operating system that runs then in that Azure VM. And that costs money. And you can also save money that way, which we'll see later, if you bring your own license. And if you think a little bit broader than Azure, but also in the cloud, for instance, you can also have a Microsoft 365 license that also costs money in the cloud. Now, these are all the things that cost money in the cloud. Okay, now how do we manage all of that? Through the beautiful animation. So we have two main product categories that can do something with these costs. The first one is Azure Cost Management and Billing, which we'll see in a minute. And the second one is Azure Advisor. Now, Azure Advisor looks at all of the services and all of the things that cost money in your Azure cloud, and then advises you on how to save money on that. So, for instance, it will alert you that you maybe not have the right pricing tier for your Azure VM because it's underutilized, and it will tell you, hey, maybe you should scale this thing down. Or maybe something is running that you haven't used in a while, and maybe it says, well, maybe you should auto stop this feature so that you can save some money in the cloud. So go to Azure Advisor on a regular basis. It's a free thing. It will show you recommendations for pricing, also other things like performance and availability and security, but definitely also for pricing. And it's very useful. Now, the second thing we were talking about was this Azure Cost Management and Billing. And this is really two things. It's billing. So you can manage and see your invoices. You can manage your payment methods, like your credit card, for instance, your billing address and your tax ID so that you have your whole administration complete. That's all fine. But maybe more interesting for us in our scenario here is the cost management thing, where you have cost analysis, which I'll show in a second, in which obviously you can then analyze the costs of your Azure services, of the things that cost money in the cloud. You have budgets, which you can set and can create alerts. And then you can also have alerts, which have budget alerts, but also different types of alerts. I have a slide in a second that explains the difference. And you can also connect AWS to your cost management and billing so that you can get all of the costs that you are making in AWS and also show that here and analyze it when you have a multi-cloud. And then finally, you can also export your billing data if you want to manage that within your own administration. Now, the difference with all these alerts that I just said, that's a bit confusing. You have budgets and you have alerts. So you can have multiple types of alerts. You have budget alerts, and I'll show you a budget in a second, in which you can say, well, this subscription should only cost 10,000 US dollars per month. And if it reaches 90% of that, I want an alert. But you also have credit alerts and department spending quota alerts. These things are specific to enterprise agreement customers. And a credit alert, for instance, is when an enterprise agreement customer prepays for their services, which is an option that they have. When, let's say, 90% of that money is spent, then you can get an alert. Just like you get that with your mobile service provider when, for instance, 90% of all your data is spent. They will send you an SMS, hopefully. And kind of the same thing is with the department spending quota, but then for a specific department and for a specific scope there. Now,
Do companies have, like, they have cloud spending managers at this point, right? Because, like, when I think of Azure, I go into the
yes,
portal, and I am the
yeah,
admin, I am the developer, I am the deployer, I'm one person. But in large systems like this, we have devs in the portal, we have IT and DevOps people in the portal. I
yeah.
assume now we're gonna have accountants and budget managers running around the portal as well. So I'm trying to understand the relationship between a coder
Yeah.
and the money person.
Yes, it depends. Again, I hate saying that always, but in large companies, I have seen that where they have dedicated people that actually manage the costs of their huge Azure subscriptions. So usually they have multiple subscriptions, and that person then makes sure that all of these descriptions are nicely tagged and organized into resource groups and management groups so that he or she can then track all of the costs, set budgets, and then alert the right people to the right things. And one thing that you also see there is that these people also uh, take good care of cleaning up unused resources, which is one thing that you can do to prevent costs going up, which we'll
Yeah,
see in a
that's
bit as
hugely
well.
helpful, and getting these alerts, being aware of these things, even writing your own scripts to decide,
Yeah.
turning VMs off on the weekends or warning someone that, "Hey, you brought a VM up," or even better, making resources that auto expire because you know that they
Yes.
exist in a resource group or in a context that means that they don't need to stick around. But I think we've all turned a VM on, jumped on an airplane, and then woken up to a couple $100 bill, but it's our fault. I turned the thing on. Maybe it could have auto expired, or maybe it could have sent me an alert, and I would have saved some money.
Yes, and there's many tools for that, including let's say Azure Dev Test Labs, for instance, where your scenario there, the VM would then automatically be spun down or shut down after a certain time of being idle, and we'll see all that in a second as well. But it's a very important part now because when you start using Azure for all of your development and all of your resources that you're running, the bill can become quite high, of course. Now, let's take a look at this cost management in the Azure portal. Here we are in the Azure portal, and this is the cost management overview, and this is the cost analysis blade. And so in this blade, you can slice and dice all of your resources in different ways and sections to see which things are costing you money. So what you can see here is for my whole subscription here, this is costing me as much money per this date. And here we can see per service, for instance, what is costing me money, like my Azure App Service, my Redis cache, and my SQL database, per location, also per resource group, if I want to see that. And there's different ways to slice and dice this. So for instance, this is kind of a similar view, also cost analysis. And here we see it within resources. You see it in a different view. Here you can also see the tags, for instance, and I can then easily sort on which things are costing me the most money and then pick those out and drill down into them and take a look at what that actually is. Like, all right, this is an app service running in a basic B1 app plan. And then I can start to take a look at if that is actually what we need for this particular service here. So this
Yeah,
is
it's not
great to get.
necessarily just deleting things or spinning things down, it's right-sizing them as well. I've found
Yes,
a P1 or a premium and said, "This thing only needs a B1 during this season." So you can turn things down on weekends, on seasons, right-size them based on your needs, which could save you money over the course of a year.
absolutely. Yes. And right sizing is very important. Also, auto scaling. And that's one of the benefits of being in the cloud, of course, that you can scale up and out or in and down when you don't need them. So you can make your app service plan, for instance, smaller or your VM smaller whenever it's not being used. You can't do that with on premises resources because then you actually already bought the service or the server. And now you can scale that in. That's one of the benefits of the cloud. Right. So that is cost analysis. And then here we also have these budgets that I just talked about. And budgets, this is a budget that I created. It is for 40 euros. And
Could we
if
do a
it,
little control plus there for me? Thank you, sir.
there we go. So, and here are these budgets that I just talked about. Now, this is a budget that I created for 40 euros. When it reaches that, it will send an alert that we can then see in cost alerts, which shows these budget alerts and also other alerts that we've just spoke about as well. And then you can add rules to these alerts, like who sees these alerts, where do we send these alerts, and maybe a little workflow after that alert as well. Now that we know what things are costing money in the cloud and how we can look at and analyze things that are costing money in the cloud, let's take a look at how we can reduce those costs, because then we can act upon it. So what are some ways to reduce costs in Azure? Well, we have some general cost reductions, and I'll dive into these a little bit deeper. We can use discounts as well. We have specific discounts like Azure Spot VM, which I'll show in a second. You can reserve capacity, where you literally say, well, I want to use the capacity for this virtual machine, for instance, for the next 3 years. And by saying that, you can save some money. You can bring your own license, and you can also turn auto start and stop for certain services on or off, which will save you money as well. So some general cost reductions. So like you just spoke to already, Scott, you need to right size. So scale to the right tiers. Use auto scaling as well wherever possible. So whenever your service is idle or underutilized, you scale back to a tier that costs less. You can also create policies. And this is a very interesting thing as well. Let's take a look back in the Azure portal here. Because in Azure portal, there's a thing called Azure policy. And in Azure policy, you can see definitions. And you can create and assign definitions. So if you are a developer or if you are one of those money managers for Azure, you can create one. Let's say, for instance, like this one, the allowed virtual machine size SKUs. So let's take a look here. This is all JSON where you can define it. When I assign this policy definition, let me assign it to my subscription here. All right. And now I can select the parameters. So now I can assign, all right, I want people in this subscription to only use, let's say, these SKUs of virtual machines, so that I know for sure that nobody is using a GPU-sized virtual machine, for instance, which is going to cost me a lot of money. Then I can assign this. So this is a brilliant way to actually save money by not allowing people to spin up certain services or certain SKUs, certain service tiers, which is great.
That is so powerful. I mean, like, just knowing that that exists, I hope will make someone watching go, "Wow, I had no idea." Like, we've had a problem where someone's been spun up too big of a VM or too much SQL for what they needed. And then you can do this by role, by role. So you can say
Yes.
that here's a named role of developers, here's a managed identity that cares about this, and the devs don't get to have premiums because that's going to cost. Staging does this. Don't accidentally spin up something that you can't ultimately afford. I didn't even know this existed, which is brilliant.
Yeah, so like you say, you can set it by role and also by scope, where you can say, well, for production, all of these things are allowed. And for instance, for dev test, only these SKUs are allowed, which are then lower tier, for instance, which is,
That's so cool.
it's so relatively easy to actually implement, but you really need to do it. And then you can save lots and lots of money. So that's creating policies as a general cost reduction. You can also, of course, clean up unused resources. This is a bit of a more difficult thing to do. Like you alluded to, you could write your own script to take a look at which ones are underutilized. Also, I would advise take a look at Azure Advisor, because that will also tell you which resources are underutilized or have not been used for a while. And if you have a very big company and a very big Azure utilization, you might have a dedicated person that actually goes through this. However, in any sprint that you have as developers, it might be a good idea to just, every other sprint or so, just add an item where you say, right, we're going to look at all of our Azure resources and we're going to take a look at which ones we are using and which ones we are not. And we are either going to delete them or we're going to right size them, for instance. Just make it an action item, because costs is a primary thing, is a primary property of what you're doing here, just like performance, scalability, and security. And then another one is automatically scale down or in, which is kind of like scale to the right tiers as well. Now, you can also use Azure discounts in lots of forms. So for instance, you might have noticed just here in the Azure portal that I am using Visual Studio subscription benefits. So if you have a Visual Studio subscription, and lots of developers do, that comes with Azure benefits. So I don't know how much it is. It depends, I think, on the tier of Visual Studio subscription. But for instance, $130 per month that you get to spend on dev test resources within Azure. So that's a great way on reducing your costs overall as a company, as developers can then test out their services within this budget. Another way is to use a Microsoft Managed Service Provider, or MSP. These are partners of Microsoft, and when you are running an Azure subscription, let's say for production, you can have one of these MSPs run that for you, manage that for you, and they usually will do that by offering you also a discount on your total Azure bill, which is often significant. And then if you get bigger and spend more, then you can get an enterprise agreement with Microsoft. And within an enterprise agreement, I already said that as well, you can also prepay for several services where you dedicate, well, I'm going to spend $1 million on Azure this year. I know this already. And so because I know this, I can prepay this, and therefore I can get a hefty discount as well. So talk to Azure, talk to Microsoft as well for these discounts, because they are definitely available and they can be large.
Yeah, those prepaid, I can definitely say personally, those prepaid discounts, those reserved instances, it can be huge, 30% or more.
Yes, definitely. And this is then all subscription wide. And then there are also specific discounts for instance, specific services like Azure Spot VMs. So Azure Spot VMs, when you do that, that's a pricing option of an Azure VM. And that also offers a big discount, like up to 90% compared to pay as you go. And it is that your VM then uses the Azure capacity that Azure has left over. So not all capacity is actually used up, and then you can use that to run your VM. But if that capacity then is needed, then Azure gets to evict your VM by doing what you tell it to do. It could be that it stops the VM or that it deletes the VM, and obviously that then does not have an SLA there, but that does mean that you can get a hefty discount.
Yeah, these are
So
great. This is like a rental car that you can drive around, except if someone else wants it more, then they can take it from you and you have to walk. But you get a really, really, really inexpensive resource, which is huge. That's a great point.
exactly. So this is great for non-production VMs, for instance, something that you use for development or something. And
Mhm.
here in the Azure portal, in the Create a Virtual Machine blade, you have this option to already enable it when you create a machine. You can say, I want to run this with an Azure Spot discount. There you go. And then you can tell it how to evict your VM if that the time comes. The
Right.
capacity
And
only.
the even better, the best part about this is that you can say, well, when capacity disappears or when it meets your max price. So you can just say, oh, the VM
Yes.
shut down, I'm out of money, and it's totally you in control.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah. So that's a great way to reduce your costs with a VM if you are running a non-production VM, because obviously you don't get an SLA with this type of thing. Also, you can reserve capacity for VMs and also other resources. So like I already alluded to, you can say, well, I know I'm going to use this VM for, let's say, 3 years. So because I know this, I can reserve the capacity for this VM and therefore get a hefty discount. So you can pay upfront or on a monthly basis, and you can cancel or exchange the reservation at any time. And another important thing as well is that you can bring your own license. So, like I said, things that cost money in the cloud are also software licenses. So, these are things like your SQL Server license, which can be very expensive if you have that for an on premises SQL Server, or your Windows Server license, for instance, which can also be very expensive. Now, if you have such existing licenses, you can take them with you in the cloud uh, and use that with Azure Virtual Machines for what's then called an Azure Hybrid benefit, which goes up to huge benefits as well. So here again in the Azure portal, this create a VM blade. In here, I was going to create a Windows Server 2022 Data Center Edition VM. And here, all the way at the bottom, I can say, I want to bring my own existing Windows Server license. And like you say, I can save up to 49% on this whole thing. So that's a lot of money. And you need to think about those things if you already have existing licenses for SQL Server or for Windows Server. There are lots of ways to reduce your costs in Azure, and these are just some of them. You can see more at aka.ms/cost optimization, which is this website where you can see more cost optimization tricks as well that you can use to save money in the cloud and that you can use to analyze what things cost money in the cloud for you.
Very cool. Well, thanks so much, Azure Barry, for hanging out with us. You can go again to aka.ms/cost optimization. We've got links down here in the show notes and on the overlay. I'm learning all about managing, reporting, and reducing costs in Azure today on Azure Friday. Hey, thanks for watching this episode of Azure Friday. Now I need you to like it, comment on it, tell your friends, retweet it, watch more Azure Friday.